Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to another modelling tutorial. Now some of you may have noticed in my recent videos on Pickwick Yard that I've done some work on the buffers at the end of the sidings lately, and as you can see I have the Peco Bufferstops here, and these are just as they come out of the packet. They're pretty standard but a bit basic, so today I'm going to show you a quick way to improve them. I've seen a few other videos on YouTube on this very subject, but I figured I'd give it a go anyway just to put my own spin on it. So the buffer stops actually come as a mini kit. You get two side pieces and then also the main buffer beam that spans the gap, and putting these together is really simple. Take one of the sides and the buffer beam, and the side has a peg on the front that pushes into a hole on the buffer beam. Once you push one side in, simply repeat that step with the second side, and there you go, you've built your buffer stop. So thank you so much for watching everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and no, I'm only kidding. You could absolutely leave it here if you wanted to, but we want to take this to the next level, don't we? So stick around to see how I'm going to do that. So firstly, I'm actually going to take the buffers apart again, and this is so that I can glue them together, which just makes them a little bit more solid, especially if these are going to be permanently attached to your layout. All I'm doing here is adding a little bit of super glue to the peg before pushing it into the hole on each side, and that's enough to hold it in position. If you have an offcut of track like I do here, I recommend clipping a buffer stop onto this while you're waiting for the glue to set, just so that you know the sides aren't pushing inwards or outwards at the bottom. Now, it's difficult to see on camera, but the peg that we push through the buffer beam actually protrudes out of the front a bit, which doesn't look very good in my opinion, so all I'm going to do is slice that off very carefully using a craft knife. This is another good reason why it's best to glue it all together, as it stays together even when removing the peg. I was actually able to get most of it off in one go here, but you might need to clean it up a little bit so that the area is completely flat. Obviously though, with it now being flat, it doesn't have that wood grain texture on like the rest of the buffer block. So again, using the knife, I'm just going to score in some grooves over the flat area where the peg was, just to make it blend in a bit better. Don't worry if it's not perfect, as we'll be painting this all later on. Speaking of paint, I'm going to do most of the main beam in white, so the bits between the buffer blocks and the back, and then also the lamp on top too. I'm not being too precious about this here, I'm just using a cheap brush, and it doesn't matter if I get the white in other areas accidentally either, as I'll be painting over those later on. Next, I'm going to paint the buffer blocks in red, just using a little bit of a time to cover the blocks, and as you can see now that we've got some paint on these, the two areas where we removed the pegs earlier aren't so obvious anymore. If you really want to go the extra mile, I like to add the lens to the lamp on the top of the buffers, just to add a little bit of extra detail. And I do this using a cocktail stick, because you only need a tiny amount of paint, but lots of precision. Now dip one end of the cocktail stick into the paint, and again, you really only need a tiny amount. And then just touch it to the center of the lamp where the lens is. And there you go, we now have the lens of the lamp painted in, which is a lovely extra detail. Now it's time to turn our attention to the sides of the buffer stop. It's all looking a bit pristine at the moment, so let's dirty it up a little. I'm using rail match sleeper grime here just to cover all the brown parts, and it might not look like it's making much difference at first, but actually what this does is it gives it more of a matte finish and hides a lot of the shiny plastic. Again, you don't need to be too precise here. It's actually quite nice if you have a little bit of variation between the two different browns in a couple of areas, as remember this is all dirt and grime that has built up over time, so it doesn't need to look perfect or consistent. Once the brown paint is dry, the final step is to add some patches of rust in a few areas. Again, I'm using a rail match paint. This one is light rust, I believe, which looks quite bright, but used sparingly can be very, very effective. I'm dry brushing this on in random areas, mostly where the buffers join the rails or where there are bolts, and personally, I just think this adds another level to the detail. With all the painting done, that's our buffer stop complete, and I think it's looking rather good, so let's get the buffers in place on the layout. Here's a before shot of how the Peco Bufferstops looked straight out of the packet, and then here they are again after our modifications and paint job. I think we can all agree it's just lifted them up a level, and it's really made this corner of my layout look a lot more interesting. Don't forget, you don't have to stick to my paint scheme here. There's a lot of different ways you can paint these buffers, and there's also a lot you can do to weather them further and blend them into the scene more with weeds and moss, and so don't be afraid to experiment and come up with what works best for you. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick tutorial, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit that bell icon to get notifications. But that's all for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!